Hello, good morning. Hi, I'm Melody Joy and this is Melody Joy Quilts. Today I'm going to show you how to make a puff style quilt. Lots of squish, lots of cuddle without the fuss of a normal puff quilt. A normal style puff quilt, you actually make these individual pockets and you pleat them and you stuff it with polyfill. We're not going to do any of that. I went to the store today and I picked up this extra loft polyfill batting. We are going to use 2 layers of this. We're going to use the walking foot on the sewing machine, a zigzag stitch, and we're going to create a lot of puff and loft. So this is going to be a super puffy quilt without any of the pleats. So none of the fuss. What I have here is what I've been working on the past couple days. I'm going to open this up here. This is a silvery minky. This is going to be the back of our quilt. And the top of this quilt is going to be this right here. So what this is, I had this like folded up together and tried to make it neat. This is a bunch of 4.5-inch squares. And all I did here was take 4.5-inch squares. I basically went through all my blue and silver scraps. There is batiks, there is some other prints in here, mixed them all together. There's not really a set layout. I tried to alternate darks and lights so that it has some good contrast and color. And what I'm gonna do is baste this with my high loft batting. And again, I'm gonna use 2 layers of this to really get this popped up, to give it the poof factor. And then I'm going to use a zigzag stitch and I'm gonna zigzag outline around all of these squares. That's gonna create nice little poofy pockets without making pockets. So this is kind of like a cheater method. All of the puff, none of the fuss. That's my goal today. So I'm gonna get this opened up. I'm gonna get this basted. What I will use to baste it is a combination of safety pins. I'm gonna be using some safety pins and some of this adhesive spray. And combination of both of these items is what I'm gonna use to get everything basted. Now, when I'm pinning my layers together, I'm gonna pin right in the center of these squares because I know that my quilt lines are gonna be going around each square along the seam as a zigzag. So I'm going to pin in the center of these squares when I baste. That way I know I won't even have to really remove pins. They'll be out of my way. All right, let's get going. That is going to be to put my backing fabric with the minky side, the pretty side, down to the floor. And it is going down to the floor. This is that extra lofty polyester batting. So we need to get this open. So at this point, I'm just trying to lay this batting on top of the minky, and it's larger than my backing. So I'm smoothing it out and I'm gonna trim around the edges with my scissors. Now, it's kind of hard to tell in the video, but the backing fabric was a dark gray, and so I could actually kind of see through this polyester batting, and I was just rough cutting along the edge. And then I'm not basting yet, but I'm just kind of laying everything out and trimming it to size. Okay, second layer of batting is going down. Now, again, I want it to be high loft and squishy to mimic the look of a puff quilt. So I am doing 2 layers of the high loft polyester batting. I am also using these little pink clips. I got these little clips in the craft section of Dollar Tree, and they're great size clips, and I'm gonna use them. They're bigger than the binding clips, and they're like metal with like plastic tips on them. I'm using it to hold all my layers together on the end because later I'm gonna roll and baste, and those clips are gonna hold that side all secure with all these multiple layers. Okay, I'm trimming up this last side, and then it is gonna be quilt top time. So this is what they call a flimsy, but it's all my little squares sewn together out of just all different variety of quilting cottons. I just went through my stash of fabrics. Now, if you wanted to buy some charm packs, that would be a really easy method to get a lot of squares, and then you could just sew all your charm pack squares together. Okay, I moved the camera around to give you a better angle. All I'm doing is rolling that flimsy up towards where I have all the layers clamped together. And then I'm going to go back and I'm next going to roll up these layers of batting. And then I'm going to use some of my spray and I'm going to start with my basting. And I'm going to baste with spray and with safety pins. This is to hold all the layers together. And I've got a lot of layers. I am doing 2 layers of batting. This is not normal. I'm only doing this because I want a puff quilt texture. So I'm shaking up my spray really good. You don't need a lot of this, but I just find if I do use a little bit of that spray adhesive, it helps everything hold together better. Now this batting came out of the package super wrinkly, so I'm just trying to smooth it out with my hands a little bit. Second layer of glue, spray glue. Second layer of batting coming down, smoothing with my hands, removing the lint. Okay, one more layer of spray glue. This is just to help hold all those layers together. I'm now going to grab my flimsy and start unrolling that. I just love these colors. Okay, so once I'm done with the spraying the glue part, the next part is to grab my safety pins. I'm going to add safety pins at least every other block. So I started going down just one side and then I went every other I just basically went on the lighter colored squares so I could kind of just know what my pattern was. And I aimed to safety pin right in the center every other square. Now, once I had pinned pretty well around all the edges, I brought it up to table height and continued on with safety pinning at a better level. But in order to get it all straight, I feel like I have to start pinning on the ground. It's kind of uncomfortable, but it's the only way I can make sure that everything is flat. And then once I've gone all the way around the edges, I feel like I can come back and just do the middle from the table. Basting is not always my favorite step, but the better of a job you do now, the better your finished outcome will be. That's what I have to keep telling myself. I'm trying to keep my cutting mat under where I'm working so that I don't end up scratching the surface of this table with the safety pins. Although this table is not in perfect condition already, I don't want to add more damage to the top of it. Although this is only a throw size quilt, I ended up using almost every single safety pin I own. And I think it's because if you watched my video about the brightly snowy owl quilt that I did, I had to unpick some of my quilting and redo it because I didn't do a good enough job of basting and it slipped on me during the quilting process. And I think that left me with some anxiety. And so this time I used every single safety pin I own and really basted this. Now, it's time to quilt. So I am going to slide this under my machine and I'm going to come up to the top and I'm going to start at the beginning of one of these rows and I'm going to use a zigzag stitch and a walking foot and I'm just going to use the edge of my blocks. It's kind of like a stitch in the ditch, but because I'm using a zigzag stitch, I don't have to worry because it's a decorative stitch, I don't have to worry if I'm not exactly on that line. The zigzag is going to kind of cross over the line. And I'm using a really pretty silvery gray thread, so it's adding a decorative touch, and it allows me to not have to stress about if I'm exactly in the ditch. This was a really simple, scrappy quilt top of just the 4.5-inch square sewn together, and I didn't pay that much attention to layout, but I'm enjoying how it turned out, and it just reminds me that sometimes it's the simple things in life. while complicated designs are great and beautiful, and I make those too, I was surprised how much I liked the scrappy squares. And this was kind of just an afterthought quilt of, oh, I've got all these blue and silver squares left over. Let me use these up. And then I ended up loving the result. I kept on going until I got all the way to the edge, and then I did go ahead and sew this edge down. It'll make it easier to trim the quilt up and add the binding if I sew right along the edge. So my guidelines are just the edges of the block, and I'm aiming to keep that center seam right between the feet of my walking foot. There's like a split in the metal foot, and I'm trying to get that split right over my line. And then that way the zigzag is touching both sides of the blocks. I was a little worried about how my machine would handle all these different layers, but it did fine. And I just took my time to try to use my hands to help guide it. But mostly this was a very peaceful project. And I finished all the quilting on this in one afternoon. I actually think the basting it took longer than the actual quilting. Okay, I'm starting to get excited because I'm starting to see a puffy texture coming out. My husband just walked by and he even commented on the puffy looking texture, which confirms to me that I'm going in the right direction. Okay, so now that I've done all the lines on this side of the quilt in one direction, I'm gonna go ahead and trim off some of this extra because the only thing that's a little bit difficult is just managing the weight of this quilt while I'm trying to sew. And I am using a walking foot, but even still, now that I have already gone around these edges, I'm gonna go ahead and trim off this extra. And I'm gonna start removing some of these pins. I love Minky. My kids love Minky. It makes great cuddly quilts, but it does get messy. When you are trimming this up with scissors or a rotary cutter, there will be a lot of fuzz, and that is just part of the process of using a Minky backing. If you notice in this bottom corner here, I've got two squares that accidentally ended up next to each other, the same navy blue print with like silver, and I hadn't realized at the time that I had two of the same color next to each other. But the way I fixed this in the final quilt is I put my quilt label in that very far bottom corner. So it ended up working out. The squish factor in this quilt is just very satisfying. It does make it a little hard to trim the edges. I have to push pretty hard on the ruler to kind of squish it down so that my rotary cutter is actually going to be able to cut. So I'm really kind of pressing hard here, but it's so squishy and satisfying. Okay, so I finished doing all of the lines going one way, but now I've got to go and do the lines the other way. So that is the next step here. So I'm just getting ready to do my lines, vertical lines. I've already done horizontal lines, and I'm just using in between the blocks as my guide. And like I said, the only thing that's a little bit difficult here is just managing the weight of the quilt. So I'm just picking it up and kind of piling it on the table beside me or in my lap just to kind of help it not drag against the machine. This is a really satisfying project because you're kind of doing the same thing over and over again. It just feels very easy. There's not a lot of hard thinking you have to do. Just line it up and sew down the row.
I will work down the rows until the halfway point, and then I will turn the whole thing around and go from the other side so that I never end up with more than half of the quilt under the throat of the machine. My 12-year-old was asking me why I wear these gloves, and the reason is just kind of what you see here as I'm guiding it through the machine. Because these gardening gloves are grippy and they have sort of that texture on them, that kind of sticky, grippy texture, but doesn't actually leave any stickiness on your quilt, it just gives you control. So as I'm trying to help guide it under the machine, it gives me control without having to actually grip the fabric. So it saves your fingers and your wrists.
It's all adding up. So I'm going to take out some of these pins right now from the part that's already done. I didn't want to take the time to take them out as I was quilting, but now that I've gotten past this point, I'm going to take some out just to help reduce as much bulk as I can for what I have to put in this section. It's still warm in South Texas, and the Minky Fuzz is going everywhere. I'm making the warmest of warm winter quilts when it's still hot in Texas. Maybe it's just wishful thinking. A lot of these fabrics have snowflakes, so maybe it's just literally my own wishful thinking of like, man, it sure would be nice if it was like cold. I have relatives from Minnesota, so I'm like, maybe I should have been born there. But I live in South Texas where it's hot 90% of the year. I'm only taking out pins on the part that I have already quilted on. Look at this fun texture. Isn't that fun? I just think if you want kind of a puff quilt look where you've got a lot of loft, this is a good way to get it without like being able to do this in just a couple days, like not spending, weeks and weeks. Just if you want to do something quick, this is a good method.
Okay, once you are done with all your quilting lines, the next step is to cut some binding strips. I picked up this gray fabric and I liked that it had a lot of different colors and textures in it, and I already have gray thread loaded in my machine, so I thought doing gray binding would match the backing really well, and so the thread won't show, and then also when I stitch it to the front, the thread won't show on this binding. So I'm just cutting it into 2.5-inch strips, and then I will go ahead and join those end to end. Okay, so I'm going to take the walking foot off. That's what I was using for quilting earlier. And I'm going to switch to my number 1 presser foot. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to trim with scissors, just trim the selvage off, that like white part on the end there. I'm going to take 2 strips. I'm going to put them pretty sides together, and I'm going to lay them basically at a right angle. And if this looks like a pair of pants, we're going to sew from hip to hip. And that's kind of how I always remember. And just saying that to myself every time is like, line it up on the machine till it looks like a pair of pants, and then sew from hip to hip. And then when you cut that open, it should lay nice and flat and be a little bit smoother in your binding without too many big humps. I've done this so many times, I don't even pin anymore, but if it helps you, go ahead and pin there on the corner. Get right under your needle, the corner of the top one. Line the corner of the bottom one up with whatever is your guideline on your machine, and that should allow you to get a nice diagonal line. Like I said, you can pin, you can not pin. I'm gonna take the pin out of that other one and throw it in this one. But either way, just make it to where it looks like a pair of pants and then sew from hip to hip. One of the most important things is just making sure that you're sewing the right sides of the fabric together. And what I have found out from making a lot of binding strips is it's easier in some ways to use any type of print. If you use a solid binding strip and you're piecing them all together like this, if it's solid, it can be hard to tell which is the front and which is the back of the fabric. And then sometimes you go to iron your strips open and they're like the seams are on different sides and not all on the same side. And so sometimes working with a printed fabric is actually a little bit easier because it's easier to tell the right side from the wrong side. So I'm going to trim off that corner end, and then I'm going to press that seam open, again, in the interest of having it lay really flat when I go to attach the binding. Okay, so now we just need to iron our binding strips to get them ready to go on the quilt. So I'm going to lay them pretty side down, and then I'm going to fold them with the wrong side of the fabric in towards itself, so that the only thing showing is the pretty side of the fabric. So we're just going to fold that in half, and then I like to iron it, and that just prepares it. When I come to one of these intersections, I'm going to use my fingers and first sort of press the seam open with my fingers, set it with the iron, and then iron my binding strips in half. Okay, it's now time to add the binding to the quilt. I'm now going to use my little arrows and move my needle as far to the right as I can. I'm still using my number 1 presser foot. And what I'm going to do is get the back side of the quilt underneath here. I'm going to turn this light off. I think actually what I found out is it makes it a little less glary for y'all to see. I'm going to put raw edges of the binding next to the raw edges of the quilt. And I am just going to sew with approximately a 1/4 inch seam. Now, because this is a presser foot, it doesn't usually do a 1/4 inch seam if your needle is in the middle, but I have moved the needle over to the right, and I've set my machine so that when I finish sewing, it's going to end with the needle down. When I get to the corner, I'm going to just sew off the corner there, cut my threads, then you fold it to the right so that everything's in a straight line across the bottom. Fold it back over so that you have this nice little flap here. This is what's going to help you get a nice edge on the front of the quilt later. Then I'm going to turn and I'm going to stitch down this other side. I'm going to do that with all 4 corners and sides on the back. Okay, once I've worked myself around back towards where I started, I'm going to fold these edges where they meet and kind of finger press. I'm going to trim off about a 1/2 inch away from either side. I'm going to bring that back around to the machine here. I'm going to pick up these edges, and what I'm going to do is put these right sides of the fabric together. So I'm going to open this up and put right side to right side of the fabric together. And I'm going to kind of fold my quilt around so that I can get this under my needle and sew along where I finger pressed it. Then I go ahead and trim it back down to about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I just give myself more like a 1/2 inch when I'm going to sew, just it's a little easier for me to pull it around. Then I just pull it flat and it should fit, and I just sew together that last little bit of the binding to the back of the quilt. So once I have all the binding sewn to the back, I flip the quilt around to the front, and I personally like to start a few inches away from one corner. And so I fold it over. I'm moving my needle as far left as I can so that when I run over the binding with the presser foot, it'll be about 1/8 of an inch away from that flipped over binding. When I get down to the corner, I'm going to stop, pivot, and turn. So you need to have your machine set to where at the end of a stitch your needle will be down. It makes it really easy to pivot and turn to go around the next side. And I just do that with all 4 corners. Many quilters we'll sew the binding to the front and then flip it over and hand stitch it to the back. And if that is a method that you enjoy doing, then I say more power to you, do it that way. I personally like the method of sew the binding to the back, machine sew it, stitch it to the, flip it to the front and machine stitch it down to the front. So the binding is the last step. So once you have this part done, you can also attach labels if you like. I did attach a label to mine, but then you can just stand back and admire your puffy quilt. And I will tell you, my 7th grader came home from school, got off the bus, saw this laid out on the table, started immediately petting it, and then took it up to her room and took a nap with it. So, you know, junior high student approved of my puffy quilt, and it's already been put into the rotation at our house. Happy quilting! While this quilt didn't end up quite as puffy as I first imagined, it still has an amazing squishy, cuddly texture.